non-aligned movement, meaning that it was created in the days of the Cold War between the Western Axis and the Eastern Axis. That is America, Britain, the Western powers, and then Russia, probably could even say the USSR at that time. There was what we call a Cold War of superiority of power. It wasn't an open war of battle, but it meant that many countries in the world needed to associate themselves either with the West or with the East. Now, low-developed countries, countries in Africa that benefited or wanted to benefit from both the West or and the East, decided to create a middle ground. As we understand it, the non-aligned movement, which had their own unique challenges. You know, the third world countries may not necessarily easily associate strictly with one group. And you see it happening even up to today. So that is what NAM can be viewed as up to now. Of course, things have now changed. A lot of dynamics have happened. To one extent, some of those countries that used to belong to the non-aligned movement, to an extent, may be leaning more to one side as compared to the other. The priorities at that time probably have changed a bit, but basically that is what NAM is about, where you have the subaltern countries, the third world countries, associating themselves with themselves in order to demand for the unique responses to their unique issues as mainly third world or developing nations.
Do you see any crisis of countries coming together or forming a body that unites them? Do you see any?
No, I don't think there is a problem. Because we live in a globalized world, you are better together. United you stand, divided you fall. It is easier to negotiate for certain things as a group as opposed to when you are an individual. So you find, for example, the United States of America, when fighting terrorism, President Bush at that time said, you're either with us or against us, you know. So he had what we call the coalition of the willing, you know. World wars all around, the two world wars that have been fought in, on this continent, the main two world wars, you found that one group associated with one side and the other group associated with the other. You had Germany, Japan, Italy on one end, and then USA, Britain, France, and others on the other end. Even in Africa, you tended to see the colonies had to support the countries that colonized them, you know. And so associating is very important. It helps you negotiate and also to get protected, you know. So you see, for example, NATO, North Atlantic Trade Organization, coming together to be able to protect each other. And so when you hear about the Ukraine versus Russia war, in there is the whole NATO coalition that is, you could say, supporting Ukraine, and then Russia on the other hand. and amongst in that situation, you find countries such as Uganda saying that we are not going to take sides. You know, we are not aligning ourselves with any side. We benefit from Russia, we benefit from Ukraine. So it's not in our interests to condemn one group over the other. But you see how the non-aligned movement countries came in, like Uganda sending a team to help in negotiations. So I do not see anything wrong per se with associating. The problem is values, which values are you associating with? Because if you associate with the wrong values, history might judge you really, really harshly. Yeah.
On several occasions, we've seen bodies being initiated. You've talked of the NATO and so on. There is UN. Now we are seeing G77, China Plus, and so forth. Have these bodies been beneficial or relevant to the developing country, not even the developing countries, even other countries or states which form these bodies? Are they relevant? Are you seeing them of relevant, or it is a matter of forming these bodies and that is all?
So it depends on who or which country has opted to join. Let's start with ECOWAS, for example, the Economic Community of West African States. When they came together, they had certain specific issues that they wanted to do. One of them, apart from the economics, is to protect the constitutional democracies of their countries. So you find that ECOWAS can make a demand, and in fact it has done so, where there's been a coup d'etat in a country that belongs to ECOWAS, and ECOWAS coming together and saying, no, if you do not hold elections within a specific period of time, we shall form an armed coalition to kick you out of office. So that could be seen as a benefit. In Uganda has been a part of the preferential trade area, East African community, and there are certain advantages of being part of the East African community. We are now talking about one passport. The budgets are read at the same time. We have a court, the East African Court of Justice, that listens to issues that pertain to the community. South Africa and Zimbabwe, Zambia belong to the South African Development Community, SADC, with unique advantages of movement of peace, of persons, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot that comes as a result. EU, the European Union, has had its advantages. You are looked at as citizens of the European Union. Although the United Kingdom has since moved out, or you could say England has moved, Scotland, I think, has refused to go. You can check the facts. But EU, you have free movement. Your citizens are supposed to be treated the same way. If I want to visit the EU, I probably get certain advantages if I have a visa to one country as opposed to the other. If citizens of one EU country visit another EU country, they should be treated the same way. So there are certain advantages that come with that, protection and negotiation for better markets, better businesses that happens as a result. We now have the same passport by and large, So there are certain things. You go for tourist activities, for example, in Kenya, you may have to pay the same price as a Kenyan citizen as opposed to a non-East African community citizen, things such as that. And they are all over the place. America, the US is part of that coalition. They even have their own human rights court that has brought jurisprudence that is helpful, So there is a lot of advantage that comes from having them. But I also know that there are certain disadvantages, and key amongst them is the loss of sovereignty to a certain extent, because there are certain things you're not able to do. Look at the United States of America. If you listen to that phrase, United States of America, it means that these are quasi-independent states, but they have had to lose their sovereignty to deal with, for example, the army, security, foreign affairs, to Washington, all right? But other things they continue to hold. In the same way with Uganda, as we move towards the political union, we will have to lose certain forms of sovereignty. Now with NAM as well, you might have particular things you want to do as an individual nation, but because you are part of the non-aligned movement, you'll be assumed, or you should be able to align with the values of NAM as opposed to going it your own way.
At the end of it, the climax, they come up with the resolutions and sort of. And are you seeing them being implemented? Because this is not the first summit we are having, the summits we are having. Are you seeing them being implemented?
Yeah. Well, it all depends on the political will of the organization, of the countries, all right? So you've come together, you have negotiated, you have agreed on certain positions, and the idea is that you should be able to work together. So that is what the understanding is, that you should work together towards achieving these goals that you have agreed to. So now it depends on one, political willingness, you know, the political leadership must be ready to do so. Two, your economic bag. So depending on what you are required to do, hopefully if you have the finances or you don't have the finances, that will determine how well you implement whichever resolutions you agree upon. But key is that you have sat in a negotiation, you have agreed, okay? Now, if you have agreed, that means you should be in position to implement. Is there political will? Some of the challenges will be, for example, if a new leadership crops up, there is an election and the government of the day moves, and the new government that does not agree with the values of NAM comes up. In that case, then we'll have a challenge, because whichever country that would be, then the government of the day will probably not want to implement. So there will be a challenge there. However, I teach the law of treaties, and we have what we call the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Now, if you've agreed, you've created a treaty, you've signed on it, and it's being implemented, you cannot give an excuse of your local law as prohibiting you from implementing it.
Aren't you saying it hard for these countries to implement? Because since they have their own laws, they follow policies, won't it be hard for them to implement these things?
No, it will not, because what normally happens is that you get to have a treaty depending on the country. So for example, Uganda is what we call a dualist nation. There are other countries that are monist nations. Now, with a monist nation, once you sign up on a treaty, it becomes law and implementable immediately. In Uganda, however, and other dualist nations, having executed the treaty, then you must bring it to your parliament and say, this is what we agreed upon, and the parliament must sanction or approve or ratify. And if there is need for legislation to be enacted, then specific legislation, a specific law will have to be passed to enable the implementation of whatever has been agreed. It's similar to the International Criminal Court, the statute of 1998. When Uganda became a signatory and a party to that statute, Uganda still had to come back to its parliament and pass a specific law called the ICC statute in order to give strength or to be implementable in Uganda. So regardless of the laws in place, there is a process that makes it possible for whatever it is they will agree upon to be implemented. No, that is the mechanism. The mechanism is the legal mechanism, the law that has to be implemented. Like I have said, if your constitution has made already provisions for treaties, and Uganda, you see, is not an island. We belong to the United Nations, and there are certain standards from the United Nations that we have to implement. Now we belong to NAM, and we expect that as members of NAM, those standards are required. So if you have the political will, as I strongly believe we do, because first of all, in order for you to host such a summit, you have to lobby for it. In lobbying for it, you have to convince other members of NAM that you are part and parcel of the whole ideology regarding NAM. All right. So that then becomes very critical for you in that regard, that you do adhere to the ideology, you do adhere to the value, and as a nation, because you're even hosting, you're part of the negotiations. So we should be able to see, save for you know, I now know that there can be certain drastic changes that can happen in the world. Like they say, the only constant thing is change. That could happen, that makes it difficult for implementation to happen. But having the will to do so, in my view, is something that our nation, I think, has. Well, I think economic independence is something that is very important. As long as we are not totally economically independent, then most of these resolutions will always be subject to who is going to finally find the money to do whatever is needed. He who calls the piper pays the tune. Now, if you can call the piper, you should be able to pay. But if you can call the piper and then you are going to look for someone else to pay the piper, it becomes very, very... actually, it says, he who calls the tune pays the piper. Because if you decide on doing something, then you who has called the tune, you should be able to pay the piper. So in the same way, we need economic independence to be able to do many things. When you are economically dependent on other people, on other nations, then there is limitation to what you can and cannot do. So it's my hope that one of the things that are being discussed right now are strategies on being economically independent. Yeah, you see, still at the core of decisions regarding the environment is the issue of the ability to source for alternative sources of power, you know, nuclear, solar, etc. Because I'm aware that fossil fuels have been something that the experts say cause a lot of environmental degradation. But to demand from mainly low developed countries, developing nations, that they adhere to the environmental dictates, do everything you can to protect the environment, but you're still struggling, you know. So there are some challenges there. Practical challenges. If, for example, a ban is placed on our ability to use firewood or charcoal, is there an alternative? You know, the developed nations are probably able to do that because of their level of development. I think that one of the challenges that we will face, for example, in our nation, and the NAM nations are normally tend to be low developed. You're struggling with getting to a certain middle income or developed status or income, and yet the demands on you by the other side are that you should do as we do, which is really difficult. I know some nations, the US can probably have the muscle to become a nuclear power dependent and avoid fossil fuels, but they too are still struggling. So that is just one aspect of environmental management that needs to be hopefully properly discussed. And maybe as NAM, they can then be able to speak to the other Western, Eastern Axis powers in negotiating for better terms or support in order for them to be to lead clean environmental development processes. So the support will come, but like we said earlier, when you are part of a bigger group, you can negotiate easier. If you are alone, you can be easily bulldozed. Now, so that's what I think. And of course, the environmental conversation is much bigger. I've heard about carbon footprints and so on and so forth. I think the planting of trees that needs to be emphasized, doing business and avoiding or being part or agreeing to fight the misuse of the polythene paper bag, among other things, are things that our nations are able to do, but will still deal with the question of power, energy. How do we deal with energy? So we'll probably continue using hydroelectric power, which may not have been accessed by all in our nations, but the progress is going on. Thermal power, nuclear power, but I do not see those who are living below the poverty line immediately changing from the use of either fossil fuels or charcoal, which I hope are going to be conversations, sober conversations that can be held in that regard, to see how do you help your people while at the same time planning for the future.
Uganda to host the NAM Summit and B77 China. One would like to, are you saying it was relevant to Uganda? Is it timely to be hosted by Uganda?
You've just said that we have over 100 nations that belong to this summit. So all the focus is going to be on our country, And I think that is a good thing insofar as the name of the nation, the opportunity to sell our hospitality, our tourism, our products, and to have an opportunity to show what we can do, what is unique about our nation, especially in terms of, sometimes we've had a bit of battering in the press regarding different issues, but now we get an opportunity and even to make some money from the delegates, to boost our tourist industry. And I'm sure those who have invested heavily in the tourist industry get an opportunity to showcase the uniqueness that we have, our big five animals, the green, the lush green. There's a lot of good that is in Uganda that this gives us an opportunity. And you see, whereas the emphasis is on the NAM countries, I know that the other parties are watching, or they may even have been invited to come and see. Of course, I'm not a delegate, but they've been invited to come and see, and any country with an ambassadorial presence in Uganda will be very interested to hear what negotiations are going on. And so the attention of the world, to a large extent, you could say, is in Uganda. Every country, every state that comes and sends a delegate participates in the negotiations by presenting the unique interests of their nation, stating their case, what their priority is, and the negotiations have to happen sometimes throughout the night, to enable them to come up with a solution on the way forward. So that negotiation, which involves all the delegates representing the countries, shows the participatory nature of many of these events, such that by the time you come to a declaration or a statement, you have all agreed, You have pulled back and forth, you've lost some, you've gained some, until you agree, on what you want to do. Yes.